We're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPEX, BREC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
My name is Cordell Heyman. I am the board chair of the Center for Planning Excellence. This is my 13th opportunity to welcome you or your predecessors to this event, and I think you'll find this to be one of the most interesting and exciting and informative events that we've had. For the last 12 years, I was preceded to the microphone by our CEO, Boo Thomas. Many of you may know that Boo has now retired, and she informs me that she will be here today, though I haven't seen her yet, so I know you'll want to greet her, and I know she's very proud of she's made it. I know she's very proud of the organization that she stood up and that will be on display today. The Smart Growth Summit is a cornerstone of CPEX's commitment to smart growth in Louisiana. Though the issues, challenges, and priorities shift from year to year, the need for good governance, sustainable, natural and built environments, efficient use of public resources, effective leadership, and a well-informed citizenry is constant. Everyone is busy all the time, it seems, but we must break from our routines occasionally and take time to reflect on what must be done differently to create the changes our state needs to be vibrant, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous. The Smart Growth Summit creates that space. It sets the stage for planning and progress in Louisiana, and we need leaders of every kind from every sector and part of the state to be here and participate so we can take the knowledge and ideas that are generated during these 2 days and put them to work making Louisiana the state we all want it to be. This has been an exciting year at CPEX leading up to the summit. CPEX has been very busy doing resilience planning at all scales throughout the state, continuing to work with towns and parishes to develop comprehensive plans, complete streets implementation plans, and small area plans that chart the course for improving quality of life for Louisiana. CPEX has worked to advance policy initiatives dedicated to improving the performance of public investments in infrastructure, increase access to complete streets, transit, and active transportation opportunities, and also improve regional connectivity in the Baton Rouge region as a founding member of the Crisis Coalition. At the state level, CPEX just wrapped up a 2-day workshop where we work with Governor Edwards' office to convene the secretaries of every Louisiana state agency for a full 2 days to gain a full understanding of the range of impacts of climate change and the way it affects their mission and operations going forward. The workshop resulted in some big takeaways. There was a realization that the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, CPRA, cannot tackle these issues alone. Every agency has a role to play. CPEX is continuing to work with the governor's office and these state agencies on next steps. I want to thank Governor Edwards and his staff. His foresight and willingness to do what's right, even when it's hard, is the kind of leadership we need more of in Louisiana. 2018 has also been an exciting year because we celebrated the 20th anniversary of Plan Baton Rouge and the retirement of Boo Thomas. We have welcomed our new president and CEO, Camille Broome, who I will introduce to you now. Camille is an environmental scientist with extensive experience in resilience planning and climate adaptation. She holds a BA from LSU as well as an MS in environmental sciences, and she's about a year away from her PhD in environmental science. She's been part of CPEX for more than 10 years. During that time, she expanded our impact in building out a coastal portfolio that was one of the first to focus on human and community level resilience and adaptation planning needs. Camille has led our team of planners in their work with over 30 Louisiana communities, And here in Baton Rouge, spearheaded the Government Street Better Block, which has led to the largest road diet and complete street transformation that I have seen here. We're excited about her leadership, vision, and entrepreneurial spirit, which will be on display throughout this conference. So before I pass the mic over to Camille, on behalf of the entire CPEX board and staff, I want to say thank you to our members. We are a membership organization. The dollars that you give us for membership are the critical funding that we need to do much of the community building activities that we do. So I would encourage all of you, if you're not already a member, to consider becoming a member and help support this ongoing work. I would also like to thank the Smart Growth Summit sponsors who will be publicized as the event goes along. They've helped us to cover the cost of this event and create this opportunity for making connections, building community, learning, and plotting out our next steps for improving livability in Louisiana. A special shout out to Jennifer Stenhouse-David, who as always has been the spearhead of the planning of this event, and I know you'll want to thank her and our staff for their good work. So with that, I will pass it to our CEO, Camille Manning Broome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cordell. And Boo, who I see here. Without them, we might not be here today, and we certainly wouldn't be in a vibrant downtown, which we didn't have 20 years ago. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm glad you're here too. We have a very special 2 days in store for you. I'd like to reiterate our gratitude to the sponsors of the summit. We would not be able to bring in this caliber of experts and foster this networking and knowledge exchange without their support. Thank you. Before we dig in, I want to share a poem with you. It's a peek into the lives and experiences of some of the Louisiana residents CPEX and our partners are committed to serving. Chancellor Zero Skidmore is a poet, educator, and organizer from Baton Rouge. He's been nationally ranked as one of the top 5 slam poets in the nation and is the world top slam poet and is the executive director of Forward Arts, an organization dedicated to teaching poetry to teens in the Baton Rouge area. Zero composed Watery Hopes and Dirty Plans, using transcripts from interviews CPEX conducted with residents of 3 at-risk coastal communities, Buras, Chauvin, and Thibodaux. During these interviews, residents expressed their memories of life on the coast, as well as their fears and hopes for the future of their coastal homes. These are their words. It's my pleasure to introduce Zero.
I was born and raised in Thibodaux. My mama's maiden name was Chauvin. Empire wasn't a very bad place for me to grow up. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I grew up fishing and going to church. I teach English in the same classroom I learned English in. I was planning on living my whole life here. Everybody knew everybody. The faces have changed. My parents live out of the country now. The people of means moved to higher ground. Elevation is key. We see people coming from lower-lying areas, people from other places that don't get the culture. Indians and Chinese taught us how to live here. We moved up in the food chain of life, but we didn't look back. Nobody lives in the house after their parents die. My next home should be a condo in the cemetery. My generation is the last. You had to be a good storyteller. I learned it at my grandmama's kitchen table. Before we evacuated, she kissed the door. I think everyone has to keep an open mind. It's a trade-off, but the city's gonna come out on top. The city has a master plan. Hope is not a plan. Our French is a dying language. We try to keep an open mind. I feel like I'm pretty well rooted here. I have a decent-sized property down here. When my grandmother was a kid, it was cotton fields. When I was a kid, it was cattle. Now we hunt ducks. Now we hunt hope in areas that have converted to open water. To think you might not ever be able to stand on the place you always stood. I like people to see where I stand. We put our money where our mouths are. That work is sometimes a money grab. 30% of the nation's oil comes through here. I wonder why they haven't done anything to figure out the erosion. Hope they figure it out while some developers use the streets as drainage features. Dry house, can't leave property. Tax base declined. Not enough money to maintain public property. The floodgate is public property, a huge wall protecting one community and leaving the other to hope for itself. They're going to flood us out to save the town. Katrina, Rita, and then you had Gustav and Ike. I forget the order. I get confused with the hurricanes. I always say the wrong one. I always hope the wrong plan. Trying to get a permit to rebuild the levee back to existing height. Finally, after 2 years, they told us we didn't need a permit. We need a plan. I know this one particular statue. It's this little girl kneeling on the ground, looking into a pool of water, and you can see her reflection. That little girl each year is more and more in the water. And I don't know if we can get the toothpaste back in the tube. Elevation is key. Elevation is keys to new doors. I buy flood insurance, but poverty is relative. Thibodeau needs to maintain its employment source, but how do you keep the bodies? People of means move to higher ground. Erosion of culture. Was planning on living. Hope is not a plan. Water at my doorstep. I once stood outside 2 days with a gun to stop cars from creating waves. It is a relatively safe community. Poverty is relative, but not a plan either. If you lived here, would you be looking to move? Is that adaptation? Plans are adapting. Adapting is relocating. My generation is the last. I remember she kissed the door before we left. I was planning on living my whole life here, she said. What if we don't come back? Would this just be open water? Is hope some open door, a door we don't want to kiss goodbye? I was planning on living my whole life here. Now, I'm just hoping. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zero. I don't know about you, but those are the real words of people, our people. And every time I hear that poem, it makes me realize the importance of our mission and what we're doing. And we are not alone. The challenges we're experiencing in Louisiana are impacting coastal communities around the globe. And globally, actions are being taken to address climate change, but will it be enough? Just last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which consists of the world's leading scientists, reported that we have little over a decade to drastically reduce greenhouse gases to avoid catastrophic global consequences. That same month, the federal government released a report anticipating an additional 7 degrees Fahrenheit temperature increase over the next 80 years. To put this in perspective, there is 1 degree difference between an ice cube and water. Every degree of temperature increase has dramatic effects on multiple systems that are critical to human survival. As they rise, we will experience more droughts, increased storm intensities, deadly heat waves, forest fires, increased spread of vector-borne diseases, disruptions in agricultural productions, and continued sea level rise. Because of the dangers and disruptions they will bring, climate change impacts are expected to drive the largest mass human migration in history. These movements are already happening globally, and the impacts are hitting close to home as well. We are on the front lines of this. In Louisiana, right now, land loss and repetitive flood risk has led to 4 community relocation initiatives. These are happening in Terrebonne Parish, Point Capee Parish, and the town of Gonzales in Ascension. Our work in resilience planning and your commitment to it has never been more urgent. Can you imagine leaving your home and your community because the environment you live in is no longer habitable or poses too much of a risk? Where would you go? Could you afford to leave if you had cashed out all of your savings to pay recovery expenses over the years, and despite your efforts, your house is unmarketable? It's too risky. Thousands are trapped in similar situations. Their risk is rising dramatically while the value of their homes and their savings are disappearing. The poorest among us will carry the greatest burden, and it is morally and ethically imperative that we address this trend. The future is not so uncertain. We know enough to take actions needed to minimize losses and suffering. Even if you personally don't feel affected, the impacts of climate change will certainly change the lives of your children and grandchildren. We need to create big, transformative changes during our lifetime to ensure that future generations can thrive. Louisiana is already grappling with devastating land loss, increasingly intense and damaging storm activity and droughts, all of which is compounded by deeply entrenched poverty and racial disparities. We need to flip the script on these trends. Let me be clear. This is not just about coastal communities. It's about systems, governments, and communities at every scale. As growing risk and aging infrastructure deplete increasingly scarce resources, all jurisdictions are having to find new ways to address their constituents' needs. It's also about inland and northern communities, places that will not only have to deal with environmental changes, but will also become or could become receiving communities, destinations for those that are leaving higher risk areas of the state. In 2016, 57 out of 64 parishes were declared a national disaster. When disaster strikes, we are all impacted, whether it is our home or community that was directly hit or not. In these ways, we are all connected. We all have a stake in how we manage these risks and prepare for the future. But there is some good news. Critically important work has already begun globally and locally to develop and implement solutions needed to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Louisiana's own coastal communities are doing remarkable work to adapt amidst difficult and challenging environmental conditions. Through planning and courageous leadership, communities are developing strategies to increase their resilience and create opportunities. As they prepare for the future, our communities are seeking to expand transportation choices our residents have, build environmentally appropriate housing, incorporate green infrastructure and better ways to manage water, diversifying our economies, and preserving their natural and cultural assets, and maintain the connections with the land that so many people have. We have some daunting challenges that require our urgent attention, but there are solutions available now. Addressing these issues at all scales is an opportunity for all of us to work together. And in fact, we all have a role to play in this. It is our responsibility. And I know if you share with me the cautious optimism that if each of us redoubles our efforts in our own spheres of action and influence, we can begin to turn the tide. In many communities, local governments are slowly recognizing that business as usual development is actually increasing risk, such as allowing inappropriate development in high-risk areas and land use trends that increase drainage impacts and traffic congestion, which cripples economic activity. Meanwhile, while government budgets are stymied, everyday residents and neighborhood groups are taking these issues on and crowdsourcing their ideas to implement novel partnerships that build community. New planning tools for the testing and implementation of neighborhood improvements are being used to create rain gardens, bike lanes, art installation, all of which add up to a more enjoyable, safer, and livable place, which is also more resilient. This is the future of smart growth, building future-ready communities. That's why we're here. Your presence is a testament to the growing ranks of people from every walk of life and every sector who are committed to securing a strong, more viable Louisiana. More than 50 years ago, the late Senator Robert Kennedy said that the work of change, no matter how challenging it may seem, can send forth a tiny ripple of hope. And that tiny ripple, joining forces with others from a million different centers of energy and daring, can build a current that can in turn change the world. We may not change the world over the next 2 days here, but we can make a difference. We are each part of something larger than ourselves, a movement to ensure we build a future of opportunity and hope for all communities, big or small. So thank you for joining this 13th Annual Smart Growth Summit. It is the cornerstone of CPEX's commitment to delivering solutions for Louisiana by providing the opportunities for local leaders, practitioners, activists to learn from and engage with experts from a range of disciplines that work together to create great, resilient communities. You may have come here to listen, but we brought you here to act. So get ready. We've redesigned the summit this year to create sessions that are more interactive and results-driven. Your thoughts and experiences are key to creating the results that we need, that Louisiana needs, that the people in Buras, Chauvin, Thibodaux, Baton Rouge need. The ideas and expertise shared here will be translated into actions that build the resilience Louisiana needs. CPEX will carry this conversation further by launching an online magazine. It's called People Making Places. You can check it out at peoplemakingplaces.org. It's live today. Subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the great content that's forthcoming. And 4 of our speakers that we have at the summit this year have top articles in the journal. Before we dig into our first session, let's take a moment to discuss resilience. What exactly do we mean by resilience? If we're going to work together, we need to have a shared understanding of what resilience is, right? Well, it probably means something different to each of us, but I don't think that's a problem. It's part of the answer. To truly build resilience, we must take a holistic approach. We must understand what resilience looks like in rural and urban context, coastal and inland context, what it means for natural systems, economy, housing stock, healthcare, educational systems, what it looks like for our cultural assets and social networks, for young people, working people, old people. You get the point. We have to develop and coordinate efforts that are comprehensive in nature, considering challenges and opportunity through a range of lenses. So let's be that ripple of hope. Over the next 2 days, let's challenge the status quo, ask the hard questions, be provocative, and let's develop the transformative actions needed to flip the script and be on the upside of the movement. To continue this conversation today, with experts working on these issues here and around the globe, I'm very pleased to introduce our first plenary. Come on. We have Joyce Coffey, Andronika Morris, Rob Verchik, and Alex Kaplan. Together, these experts are going to share with us some of the most significant global and local trends in resilience. Shifts in populations, natural systems, markets, and increased climate risk affect how we assign value to different types of assets. How we cultivate and protect those assets has tremendous implications for our state, a frontier of climate change where many of the shifts are already occurring and rapidly. It's up to us to act on this information, to use what we know and learn today to determine the transformative actions we must take to come out on top. Joyce Coffey is the founder of Climate Resilience Consulting, a world-renowned expert on climate change impacts and the complex solutions required to address them in diverse contexts. She has worked for over 25 years developing and implementing resilience and sustainability strategies. Her clients include the World Bank, the Rockefeller Foundation, the National League of Cities, Kresge Foundation, and National Science Foundation. Andronika Morris is the executive director of the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance and Housing NOLA, who's provided the research, data, and strategy for the New Orleans groundbreaking 10-year housing plan. Since graduating Loyola, Morris has worked to create affordable housing opportunities in both the public and private sectors with a focus on equity and land use. She was recently named New Orleanian of the Year by Gambit Weekly, and believe me, she is a force to behold. Rob Verchick holds the Gother St. Martin Chair in Environmental Law at Loyola University. He is a senior fellow in disaster resilience at Tulane University and president of the Center for Progress Reform. His expertise in climate change adaptation, disaster law, and environmental regulation is marked by none. He's truly remarkable. Alex Kaplan is head of North America and senior vice president of global partnerships for Swiss Re, a global provider of wholesale insurance, reinsurance, and other forms of insurance-based risk transfer. Alex's expertise is developing and executing innovative risk transfer solutions to help governments, international finance institutions, and NGOs to manage their financial risk. So we are going to have a conversation. And thank you very much to Sea Grant for sponsoring this plenary. So, our thesis question: is Louisiana on the frontier of resilience? If so, how? If not, why not? Joyce?
Wonderful. Well, first I just want to acknowledge that Zero, your poem, really said it all. And it's heart-wrenching. And I think that's part of my answer to your question, is that absolutely you are on the frontier of resilience because of incredible loss. And that loss is not just at the coast. This is a very soggy place. And many of you and other leaders in the state have had to really rework what you thought your jobs were about in order to acknowledge that and to be improving livelihoods. So I would say there are three reasons why you're absolutely on the frontier of resilience. And the first one popped out at me while I was on a flight on American Airlines. Inside the American Way magazine, there was a 30-page economic development promo for the state of Louisiana. I was like, wow, this is interesting. Like, I don't really think about Louisiana as being this extraordinary place for business. It was very convincing. And on the third page, the first page of actual substance of this brochure, there was the president of the Louisiana State University saying, we want to be in the lead on helping the world determine how to migrate from climate change. I could barely believe it. By the way, that's not a direct quote, but that's what I got out of it. I mean, that is very rare to see an official essentially calling migration a strategy, number one, and number two, acknowledging that it's happening for you in your place, and number three, determining that it's something you need to get better at so that the world can find their way to progress around migration. So that was really phenomenal, and I would never want to be in the position that all of you are in Louisiana, of having to claim that as your birthright, really. The reason why you are having to kiss the door as you leave. But it's really a phenomenal thing. And then the second thing I'll get into in more detail, but I think that the communications that have happened around resilience in the state, starting at least as early as you from the coast, and perhaps even earlier, and now with LA Safe, have been profound. There is nothing that I can find anywhere else in my practice that actually starts from community the way that your work has. And I think that is something that we all need to do more of. It's very hard, and it's not what, I'm an urban planner, it's not what I was trained to do, frankly. I'm also a biologist. It's certainly not what I was trained to do there. So I really give you great kudos for that. And then the last thing I would just say is I think the conviviality of leadership around resilience in Louisiana, although it probably comes from loss, is something that I've never seen before other places either. There's a lot of love and grit around working these things out together. And I really give a lot of credit to CPEX for being the tone setter for that kind of working together ethic.
Thank you, Joyce. And Joyce, this is really, really kind words, and coming from someone with a global perspective and working across countries and states, it really means a lot. But we don't have to be that positive either. So we can say some of the hearts, some of the, especially Louisiana people can do that. And you do, Alex. You're in the insurance market. But Andronika, so are we on the frontier of resilience?
Good morning, first of all, to everybody. Thank you, Camille, for having me. And unfortunately, yes, we are on the frontier. I appreciate what Joyce has to say, and I do take comfort in it because it does mean that there is an organization, there's an infrastructure that other people do not have. It's also, she also mentioned the fact that we have to have it. Yeah. And that inspires a lot of regret, a lot of teeth grinding and consternation. And it also impedes us because no one wants to do this. Mm-hmm. No one wants to decide that they're going to abandon the home that they have cherished for generations or sometimes even days, right? This is your home. This is your piece of the universe. All of that is precious and necessary for people to thrive, and to face the idea of relocating to another community is something that it's not going to be simple for us to grapple with, but we have to because we are on the front line. I think resiliency and resilience has gotten interesting raps particularly in New Orleans. There was a pushback from the great community of the great community of New Orleans around the notion of being resilient, because people talked about the fact that it meant that you were preparing for a blow, right? That you were always, that it was inevitable that you were going to get hit, that you were going to be struck. And we're not just talking about storms, because there is inevitability to that, but also to the inequities that come in the storm response. That's what the people of New Orleans push back against, always preparing ourselves for some new catastrophe that would be exacerbated by the deep-seated and deep-rooted inequity, that we could never just get past that. And so that is why this community effort is so important, so that when the next catastrophe hits, as we start talking about migration and relocation, that it is not, those things in themselves are not another catastrophe that this community has to overcome, that these communities have to somehow survive, that they have to be resilient against the good intentions or the necessary changes that they need. That's how you get people staying despite the fact that there was a storm warning, because they don't trust that the decision makers are coming from a place of looking for their safety. So you have to start at the community. And I've been very proud to participate with CPEX and the Foundation for Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, and the dozens of partners who've been working on LA Safe. But we need to do more. We have to listen, and we also have to start making some real, this also can't just be community. Our elected officials and decision makers also must embrace this kind of decision making, right? We'll talk about this a little bit later, about some of the changes, some of the business decisions that we're making that make migration and relocation difficult, and we keep making them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Rob?
Well, as an academic, I study disaster resilience for a living, as you know, and I've studied it throughout the United States and in other parts of the world like India and in Europe. And one of the things I just want to mention, I've just recently been part of a report that came out called From Surviving to Thriving, Equity in Disaster Planning and Recovery, which you can get on a website called progressivereform.org. I lead an organization that has been looking at climate adaptation and disaster preparation in a lot of different ways. And I preface my answer by saying, so I've looked at a lot of this, and I think that Louisiana is absolutely on the frontier of resilience, but it has a lot more to do. And part of that lot more to do has to do with the fact that we are vulnerable in two ways. We're vulnerable geophysically, and we're vulnerable from a social and an economic point of view in terms of our people. And geographers will tell you, who've studied the entire United States, that Louisiana is more notable among all other states, is more notable for its social vulnerability than it is for its geophysical vulnerability, which isn't to say we don't have both problems, but one is more notable, that is more of an outlier in the United States than the other. So here are three things. I've got three things I'll just say. Two are examples, I think, of what makes us on the frontier of resiliency. One is our coastal master plan. We have a master plan which lays out in priority structural and non-structural projects to repair the coast. I call it spot welding because we're not going to keep the whole coast that we've lost. We've lost 2,000 square miles in the last 80 years or so. But we have plans on the books, science-based, doable, in which we can, if we have the funding, produce the largest coastal restoration in the history of the world. We have a quarter of all the wetlands in the lower 48 here in this state. And we can repair those over 50 years for somewhere $50 billion, something like that. That's amazing. And the only reason that we were able to convince Congress to channel BP settlement money to our restoration and to channel more offshore oil royalties to Louisiana for our restoration. The only reason we were able to do that is because we had this master plan in place that was science-based and that was responsible, something that no other state, to my knowledge, has yet. So that's key. The second thing that puts us, I think, on the frontier of resilience movements is happening here in Louisiana because of resilience grants that came from HUD, from the federal government. They were leftover money from Sandy. We have over $150 million being channeled into this state for projects here in Gentilly in New Orleans to produce a pilot project of ecosystem-based water management techniques, some of them borrowed from the Netherlands, some of them borrowed from ideas here in the United States, where we are going to transform a neighborhood and show that you can live with water in a responsible way that improves the economics and improves the livelihoods of communities there. We also have some of those monies coming in to help the relocation of the Chitimacha Choctaw, Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe in the Ile de Jean Charles area of Terrebonne Parish, and that's something that people are watching very closely. It's one of the communities in the United States that is planning to relocate as a community, and there are probably 12 to 15 other communities like this, most of them tribal communities in the United States. Here's where we need to do more work, and I'll just stop with this. One is that we in Louisiana are not willing, in terms of our policymakers or in terms of our everyday voters, to talk about the financial responsibility that the oil and gas industry owes us in helping us to repair the coast. We have studies coming out of our ears showing that oil and gas is responsible for anywhere between 30 and 60% of the lost 2,000 square miles that I told you about. And yet there is no mechanism for the oil and gas industry to be financially accountable for that. I was last week at an entire day's session sponsored by the state on the updating of the Coastal Master Plan. I learned tons of things, but that not one word was spoken about financial accountability by the oil and gas industry because of those impaired wetlands. The second thing, and I'll be just very brief here, is that voters in Louisiana and voters in all of the coastal parishes need to be serious, not just about talking about adapting to climate change, but about stopping it. And that means reducing carbon emissions. You can't expect the politicians in the coastal parishes to be in favor of limits on carbon emissions if none of the voters in those areas are interested in supporting them in doing that. My friend Bob Marshall, who's a journalist, likens the state of Louisiana to a lung cancer patient trying to bum cigarettes off visitors to the hospital. And it's a little bit like that. We face an existential threat. We know that, and we know it has to do with climate change, and we are not, as a people in Louisiana, we will not urge our politicians to do things that would stop greenhouse emissions. And until we are able to do that, I'm not going to consider us serious about addressing climate change.
Well, I guess we've opened up the elephant in the room in the first plenary, so we want to talk about the hard truth. So thank you, Rob. Alex.
I thought I was Dr. Doom. I'm giving that title to him. No, thank you for having me here, and I'd also like to thank Ciro as well for reintroducing me to the beauty and power of poetry, because my only exposure growing up was my grandfather's World War II limericks, none of which are appropriate to share with you. That was really nice, and to Joyce, what Joyce said, I mean, very incredibly powerful, really hit the nail on the head. To the question, is New Orleans and Louisiana the pioneer of resilience? And as an outsider who lives in Washington, D.C., everybody looks resilient in comparison to where I live. But with that aside, the answer is obviously yes, you are, but because you have to be. You don't have a choice. In many respects, you're the canary in the coal mine. You are the incubator of resilience, and I'm always impressed with the state's ability to convene people from all around the globe, to bring in expertise from the Netherlands and from all across the world. New Orleans was the host to the first ever Urban Resilience Summit back in 2014, I believe. And so these are very powerful convenings where best practices are shared, but action speak louder than words, and you're already beginning to see the implementation of some of these strategies, whether it's the coastal plan or whether it's the urban resilience strategy in New Orleans, and you're seeing that risk reduction. You talked about the link between the social and the economic. They are inextricably linked, and they exacerbate the geophysical. And so we have to be addressing all of those problems at the same time. As a global reinsurer, we can't just be thinking about the next event. We have to be thinking about what the world looks like 25 to 50 years from now. How is it going to change? How's the economy change? How's the society change? And the landscape around it. As those risks metastasize across a balance sheet, we have to be very careful at how we expose our capital. So we're watching what you're doing very, very carefully. And there's so much more work for us to do. But to the point of financial, because that's the world that I come from, resilience isn't free. And it's going to cost a lot of money, and a lot of hard choices are going to have to be made, and you'll figure out where you're going to get the money from. But let me paint a little bit of a picture for you. And I did a little research as I was coming down here. 24 cents out of every dollar that the state collects in forms of revenue goes to Medicaid. If you add in education and then pensions, 76% of every dollar goes for those three things. If you include the interest payments that the state pays on existing outstanding liabilities, debt, 3% of every dollar. So 79 cents out of every dollar goes to pay for those things. You have 21 cents left over, everybody. 21 cents to pay for everything else. How are you going to use it, right? We have to think about these priorities. Not to say that those other three priorities aren't absolutely critical and important, but as we think about our future and how our demographics are shifting and how society is shifting, how are we going to fund these inevitable exposures? How do we manage this better? How do we create an economic floor for ourselves when these inevitable risks occur, right? So that we don't constantly get knocked back on our heels and have to make really bad decisions post-event. There are better ways to manage these exposures that we know are going to happen. We have to find ways not only to build physical resilience, social resilience, but equally important, financial resilience.
So how do we do that? Let's talk about
Oh,
that.
I don't.
No, we got. What's the moonshot?
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Well, okay. So from the perspective, I guess, of the insurance and reinsurance industry, I think, we always talk about how big we are, right? We've got $30 trillion of assets under management, and we're securing risk all over the globe to make sure that we can rebuild individual lives and corporations and governments across the globe. That's great. But, if you think about it, you've got the largest economy in the world, right? You look at Houston just last year, 4th largest city in the largest economy in the world, and only 20% of the total financial losses, economic losses, was actually insured. To me, that is a travesty, right? We talk about $1 of investment in mitigation equals $6 in future averted losses. For every 1% increase in insurance penetration equals a 20% reduction in taxpayer exposure from disaster losses. This is critical. And I really believe that we are at a shift even in our own industry because of 3 key reasons. 1 is technology, 2 is data, 3 is computational power. With the confluence of these 3 things, we're going to be able to start providing more value in corners of society that have often been neglected. If we talk about the fact that in California this week, 32 people have died because of wildfires. If you look at Hurricane Florence just a few months ago, 52 people died. Michael, 30 people died. And go back to Katrina, 1,800 people died. That is unacceptable, especially when you think about the reasons that they died. They died predominantly because they didn't have the financial resources to leave. When 40% of Americans have less than $400 in cash in their savings for emergency expense, and you think about the cost of an evacuation, taking your family, putting them in the car, filling the car with gas, getting them to a hotel, feeding that family, you're making a choice. You are rolling the dice with your family's safety. That is unacceptable. And so we should stop thinking about how do we ensure all of these massive risks in the singular function, but how do we ensure all of these populations in a much more valuable way? Lower dollar limits using technology, eliminate all the fluff that's in the system so that we can have access to those individuals that are oftentimes detached from the financial system in a much more readily available way.
I just want to follow up on that point about insurance. There's some very interesting research looking at 100 years of cancer and mortality from cancer. And what is the one thing that predicts survival of cancer more than anything else? Insurance. Personal insurance, health insurance. And I think that we don't have 100 years of data of mitigating our risk from climate change, but I presume that if we were to look even 10 years back, we would see that the one thing that is most likely to help people to survive and hopefully even thrive after an extreme event is insurance. So I do think that's really important, but I also think there are 2 other things that are really key. One, I'm going to quibble with the point that resilience isn't free. I think it isn't free most of the time, but ordinance and law that prohibit particular land uses is almost as close to free as resilience will ever get. So you in this room need to do yourselves a favor and make planning and regulation at the local and regional level inclusive of extraordinary resilience. And that means prohibiting growth and development in places that are risky. It's just so obvious. And it's obvious everywhere, by the way. This is true not just for Louisiana, but in here we do have some pretty extraordinary cases of, I would say, incredible negligence on the part of elected officials who are not taking the bull by the horns and making planning the free resilience, get out of jail free card kind of thing. And then the third thing I would say about finance in the state is the state of Louisiana is the largest user of federal disaster funds. And that is unbelievable. I mean, in some ways, it's great that you all have legislators that have been able to fight for you to get money in your doors, but you have become quite lazy. When those dollars come in the door, they are the beginning of a huge set of assets, but that's not how the state is looking at them. And I don't mean by this way the state in a capital S, I'm saying all of you. These funds should be leveraged for private dollars. They should be leveraged to become the nut that is the resilience bond or the climate bond or the green bond or whatever the other assets are that you draw into your to your development of mitigation of risk and hopefully pre-recovery. So I think that we all need to be much more focused on, if we do have federal money, how can we make that money times 10 so that we are doing more than simply barely recovering for only a certain set of people, but actually we are building a brilliant, resilient future for the state.
Well,
sorry, go
I was going to say, well, Joyce, I think you also started the trip into the next problem with that issue, right? Attracting private funding in the right way. Because we, as in the state of Louisiana, you talked earlier about what we have allowed, and we've allowed the oil and gas industry to do to this community. We are not helpless, but we have allowed this, and we are not even having real conversations about recapturing it. We are also continuing to repeat and replicate these decisions that seemingly want to attract private dollars because we can't just rely on federal funds. We can't just rely on state funds. We want to cut taxes for people. We have to start having these really hard conversations. The example that springs to mind, there are two examples that spring to mind for this. Where my mother grew up in Welcome, Louisiana. I'm from the River Parishes. My mother grew up in Welcome, Louisiana. Shout out there. And we just got word, and I found out about this through two announcements, one from a local economic development partner and another from the governor's office, heralding the Formosa Plastics plant settling itself in Welcome, Louisiana. If any of you are familiar with this area, it's off the Sunshine Bridge. You see Welcome on the water tower. Most people think that that's saying hello. No. Like everywhere, the name of the water tower is the name of the community. My mother grew up in the shadow of that water tower, and this is a plastics plant that was going to be settled originally in Edgar, Louisiana, where I'm from, and we fought against this. This is since I was in high school, right? Now the plant is to much excitement coming here, bringing these jobs. It is actually contributing to the area that we call Cancer Alley in the River Parishes. That is actually some of the highest ground and safest parts when it comes to weathering storms. I evacuate from New Orleans to Edgar because it's 18 feet above sea level. It is also surrounded by some of the most carcinogenic plants in the state. And here we have the state of Louisiana and our economic partners welcoming one more problem to this area. As we talk about resilience, as we talk about relocation, we continue to poison communities that could be places that people could relocate to, and just so everybody knows, poisoning the people who already live there, because this is a business decision and it's more jobs and it's more opportunities. In New Orleans, our city council recently voted to allow our local utility company to build a 20th century $200 million gas power plant so that in 5 years, when we can't meet the needs 13 days out of the year, did you hear that? $200 million so that in a few years, when we can't meet our energy needs 13 days out of the year, this peak power plant can be switched on. This is a 20th century solution to a 21st century problem, and we're doing the same old, same old. This area of the community, and it's actually going into a community in a neighborhood. It's going to impact flooding issues in that area, and our city council voted 6-1 to allow it. The only reason we're thinking about reconsidering it is because the energy company overplayed their hand and actually hired fake community people to come and protest and support it. That's the reason why it's up for possible reconsideration.
And Andronika, to tie to something that Joyce said, another piece is we need to diversify our economies. Exactly. That's also an ingredient of being resilient. If we've only got 21 cents, and we need to take that 21 cents and make it 40 or 80, and then put it to half to mitigation, or maybe all to mitigation of both social and the geophysical pieces, we're going to have new economies. And that's the opportunity here, is creating those through being on the frontier of resilience.
Well,
and so what's your moonshot?
Right, we've got to be thoughtful about it, because that's what people would argue we're doing with the Formosa plastic plants. That's what they would argue we're doing with this energy plant. They would say, and they have said, and they do say, oh, we need the jobs. But it can't simply be investing in the same old things that
right.
don't, we see it with increasing hospitality jobs and other kinds of industries. We have to make sure that we are looking forward and we're building opportunities that the people of these communities can actually take advantage of and do lift them up.
So Rob, your moonshot, what do we need? Like, go big.
Well,
what can we do?
I'll get to that. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about this, well, my moonshot, I suppose, is to think about resilience as having a lot of free aspects. And one of the things that I hear about what both of you have been talking about is that we're squandering things that essentially are free services. So think about natural ecosystem services. One just happens to be changes in the landscape, elevation, which drains land and which provides a place to safely live. And that's free, right? That's land that's designed that way by the hand of God or whatever, right? And so you can decide what to do with that free resource. You can either put a petrochemical plant on it, which, by the way, also creates contamination, and so when that water flows away from it, it goes into lower areas. You can take the wetlands, which we know protect against storms. All over the world, we have conventions designed to protect wetlands. One reason specifically because we know that they're speed bumps for hurricanes and other kinds of things. We can take all of those free resilience infrastructures that we have and give them away or tear them apart or sell them to people, or we can use them for what they are best served for. That's the capital that's the principle in our account. And we can either spend it down so that there's nothing left, or we can build off of it. And so my moonshot would be to develop commercial enterprises that are based on the natural renewable landscapes. The sunshine in this state is a natural renewable resource. We could have much more going on in solar energy, but one of the points is it's not the fact that there are just a lot of people living in New Orleans who don't have imagination, or in Louisiana who don't have imagination. There are entire industries, entire sectors of the economy whose interests are opposed to using the resources in more sustainable and, I would argue, more financially beneficial ways than we're currently doing. We have industries and entire sectors of the economy that don't want us to better preserve our wetlands, even enforce the laws that exist, which we don't enforce. We don't enforce laws already that protect our wetlands. We don't enforce laws already that ensure good storm water management plans on petrochemical facilities. We don't enforce laws already about people's access to sunshine and the development of solar power. And so we have to be serious about treating our resources in the way that are the most financially beneficial.
Yeah. So that's globally, the economy's moving to a carbon-free. It's happening globally. And so it's a matter of time, and we'll be part of a transition, I'm assuming.
Some of the best predictions are that oil and natural gas are going to peak in the next 10 to 20 years globally.
Yeah. So you provided a concrete example. And we have the mayor of Abita Springs here somewhere. Hey, so glad you're here, Mayor Lemons. He was the first to come out in Louisiana and say, we are going to be 100% renewables, which is, that's a leader. That's a champion taking a risk. Really hard to do. So what are some concrete things? If we need to make a list, concrete actions that mayors, planning directors, people that make decisions can make towards getting us to a resilient Louisiana. From a financing perspective, legal perspective, housing perspective, adaptation perspective, that's what we need to come up with. So,
Oh, I would start with
Yeah.
one. I was in a convening with a bunch of you superstars out there, and it was non-attribution. So this is not my idea, but it comes from one of you brilliant folks out there. So restorative justice is at the heart of what all of us need to do, regardless of our color or our demographic. At the same time, we, especially in Louisiana, need to be thinking about receiving communities. And that, by the way, is a term that only your state really talks about.
Yeah.
So thank you for being in the lead. But receiving communities need to be creating restorative justice. Otherwise, Louisiana is going to remain known for its social ills, even as its physical risks grow. So the idea, and the thing I would put on the very top of the list, is for your receiving communities, create restorative community development. And again, that's not my idea, it's one of your ideas. Restorative community development, meaning make sure that you start with equity first in all of the work that you're doing to anticipate the growth of your population due to the physical impacts of climate change. And Cordell, I didn't realize that the beauty that I was walking through as I came to Manship Theater, I'm brand new to Baton Rouge, I got here, maybe 14 hours ago, but that I can thank you for a wonderful surprise of real vitality, even at 8 in the morning. And yet, I also wanted to be jostling shoulders with people and waiting at the red light, instead of just walking across the street because there weren't enough cars. There is room for people in safer places, Baton Rouge being one of them. And if we make their entry at the very start, the top of the list about restorative justice, so restorative community development, which I'm sure Baton Rouge and other places have done, I think you will be, in fact, at the tip of the spear of absolute best practice around the world.
thank you, Joyce. Andronika?
So you've got a couple things. You wanted me to focus on housing here, so I'm going to jump
Yeah.
on that one. And make sure that as you're talking about recovery, right, we need to be making sure that people are building safely. There has to be hard conversations that are equity driven. You can't simply have people go in a room with experts and come up with a map that's got a bunch of green dots on it and inform community that their homes are no longer habitable. Even if that happens to be the unfortunate truth, that's not how you do it. That's not how you have that conversation. And again, New Orleans can teach a lot of communities on how not to respond when disaster strikes. And we can teach you what to do faster, sooner, right? So making sure that when you start talking about rebuilding, that housing is affordable and it's safe. You cannot meet the needs of your economic engines, be it hospitality, be it nonprofits, business, oil and gas, whatever your workforce needs. You can't say, well, we're going to build a bunch of housing in this area that's, we're not sure if it's okay, but we're going to build that, we're going to create that housing now, and we're going to create that housing there, and put people in harm's way. We can no longer do this. But you also cannot have these conversations. You've got to have the hard conversations in the full light of day, in public, and give people the opportunity to not just have their say, but to impact those plans. Those are two very different things, right? Anyone who's worked with any disaster funding or HUD funding is very familiar with the community engagement process that they promote, but you also know that it's very perfunctory. You get credit for doing it by simply having the meeting. It doesn't matter if people show up. It doesn't matter if you listen to anything anybody has to say. There is no requirement that you hear your community. It's just that you afford them the opportunity. And then we wonder why people don't show up, right? This country, in the last couple of decades, has mastered the art of disenfranchising communities by simply making it clear that nobody wants to hear from them. And we respond to that. And so their leadership looks like making that space and being authentic about it and being ready to hear someone tell you what you don't want to hear. That you can't do the smart, brilliant thing that you came up with because they don't want it. And that you have to find another way. And so that you've got to be open to that. We've got to be ready to do that. And you have to be clear that that is how these are going to proceed. Otherwise, we're going to continue having people making these very macro choices about their lives and not able to look at the next, how it impacts the community and everyone else. They're just deciding for themselves.
Great, thank you. Rob?
I want to focus on something that Joyce brought up earlier and maybe expand on it, which is land use decisions. And if we're talking about what local governments can do and the interplay of law, this is the place. And it's the Achilles heel in almost every community that's exposed to risk. One, in terms of land use, is we have to decide where the places are that just aren't going to be open for any kind of development. That's a hard choice, but it can be done. We don't want smart growth in dumb places. I have a friend who coined that term, and there's a lot of smart growth in dumb places around the country. But the other thing is, and I think that this is overlooked, is we also need to think about how space is used when it can be developed. In other words, there are some places that it would be okay to have a shopping center maybe or some kind of commercial activity, but not okay to have residential areas. And we need to be more serious about that. And we also need to be more serious about how things are built in terms of building codes, for instance. The other thing that local governments could do is spend more time thinking about how energy is generated and delivered within their communities. That's another real Achilles heel, is our power grid. And although a lot of that is regional and national in scope, there are decisions that can be made at a local level which provide what kind of electricity is going to be drawn upon in terms of portfolio, or which in terms of how people can generate electricity within their own spaces and in their own communities. And solar energy and wind energy are much more resilient in times of disaster than the others. Windmills can kick up even after a storm, and solar power arrays often the same, but that's not true of sort of larger utilities. The last thing that I think is central to everything that a local government does is local governments have to incorporate climate projections and best science in any decision that's long-term. Because the 500-year floodplain today is going to be a 100-year floodplain or a 50-year floodplain just a few years from now. We're seeing that in Houston, for instance. And there should be legal mechanisms that require the best science available on topography, on flooding, on precipitation patterns, these kinds of things. That information is available right now from NOAA at a pretty fine-grained level to communities, but you have to know where to look. The EPA has a website on it, NOAA has a website where you can find this information. But if local communities are not required or encouraged or educated about using this information, they won't, and decisions that could have saved lives will not have been made as a result.
Alex?
I would say, it's going to sound a little soundbitey, but plan as if the future matters. And also plan as if the federal government does not exist, right? I mean, you know, if you just look at the trend, I mean, the sustainability, the path that we're on, the trajectory that we're on is entirely unsustainable if you look at the federal government, right? So as of right now today, 119 presidentially declared disasters in 2018. Last year, 137. Juxtapose that to the 1980s when the average was 28 per year, right? President Trump just signed another declaration this morning for California, or last night for California. And so I suspect that the number even this year will beat last year's. So that number's going up, which means the federal government's being spread very thinly. And so when we think about land use planning and building codes, et cetera, you know, these are decisions that are made at the state and local level. And then irrespective of the quality of that decision, the expectation is that the federal government is going to come in and make you whole. I think if anybody understands if that being the case or not, it's Louisiana. And we have to just plan our resilience as if the federal government doesn't exist. And if they come in to help us, great. But that's a better way to plan for resilience, right? A bailout is not a strategy. And so we have to be planning accordingly. I also think just the broader community, outside of just, let's say, like the political leadership, is we all have to change our language. You just mentioned the floodplains, right? Mm-hmm. We talk 100-year floodplain. You're either in it or you're not. Well, that's not physically possible it's not on or off, right? There are 100,000 homes in Houston that were not in a floodplain that all had damage from flooding, and less than 20% had flood insurance in that particular instance. If it rains, it floods, okay? And so we just need to be changing the way we communicate. And I think the insurance industry has a lot to blame there, right? We talk about 1 in a 100-year event. Well, what does that mean? Well, if I say, actually you individual, have a 24% chance of flooding during the course of your 30-year mortgage, now I've made it a personal figure for you, and perhaps that changes your behavior a little bit. So again, changing that language, but also the land use planning, I think, is an absolutely critical point. Bad decisions should have a cost associated with them, right? And when we talk about political leadership being asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less, right? We've got 21 cents. Well, how do we make that 21 cents into the 40 or the 50?
Yeah.
Bad decisions have to cost something.
Yeah. Bring us into the negative.
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, you see some communities now instituting policies like, we'll give you credit for the area of green space on your lot. Mm-hmm. If you want to pave the whole thing into a big parking lot, that's on you, but you are paying for that because you cannot retain any rainwater, for example.
Yeah.
And so somebody else is going to have to absorb it, so that's on you.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about maladaptation. We seem to be making a lot of maladaptive decisions because everyone wants a smoking gun. We need to fix this. And it's easier to point to some big project versus changing the way we develop. And Alex, you have a great story with the coral reef in Mexico that like a Swiss Re is insuring. But let's have a conversation about maladaptation to make sure that we're clear on what that is and that we don't make those decisions. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of years ago, I mean, everybody's familiar with the Mesoamerican Reef. It's the second largest coral reef in the world off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And you've got an entire community that's built up around it, Cancun, right? And the surrounding region. And they've been putting money into an account over the years, all the hotels and the broader community, to help beach renourishment. The Nature Conservancy comes in and starts looking at the reef and its risk-reductive capacity. And they realize that a vibrant coral reef can absorb 97% of a wave's energy. And then there's some point in that catastrophic event, hurricane, that reductive capability collapses. The reef is impaired, it begins to break down, and then they lose, let's say, a meter of reef. Now, historically speaking, what happens is everyone in that hurricane, let's say Hurricane Wilma, everyone's concerned about picking up the umbrellas and the deck chairs and the broken Corona bottles, and no one's focused on the natural environment around them. Well, with that modeling research from the Nature Conservancy, everybody kind of realized that, wow, because of that reef being there, the beach is here. Because the beach is here, we have tourists that come and spend billions of dollars every single year. So we have an interest in the viability and the survivability of that natural asset. So we have to find a better way to protect it. And so with that, we are able to design an insurance mechanism to actually insure the reef. What we're using is something called parametric insurance, which I talk about quite often, and I do believe it is the frontier for the insurance industry. I believe it's where we're going. But instead of having what we call is like loss sustained, right? You do a little bit of damage, you bicker back and forth with the insurance agent, you get a check, and you have to fix the thing that broke. With parametric insurance, you're insuring against the circumstance, the environmental trigger, right? It's a strength of a hurricane. It's the ground shaking from an earthquake. Boom, that's the trigger. Here's your money. Go do what needs to be done. In the case of the reef, though, that isn't the innovation. The innovation here is that we're, for the first time ever, insuring something that no one owns, right? In every insurance contract, you have to be able to prove insurable interest, right? I can't buy life insurance on any of you in the room, right? That would be illegal. But you have to be able to prove that insurable interest. And we are able to make the case that, again, because that reef is there, because it is vibrant, that beach is there, the tourists are there, and the hotels have an investable, insurable interest in that reef. And here's the really cool part. When the insurance policy triggers, the money is used to basically fund what we refer to now as the guardians of the reef. And this community of trained professionals goes out and picks up the broken coral reef. I didn't know this. But if you collect the broken coral within 48 hours of it being broken, you can replant it. And the reef begins to regrow almost immediately. And if you don't, the reef dies and it's been impaired for probably a generation. So the risk reductive value goes down, the insurance premium goes up. They now have a financial incentive to get the people out there and fix the reef.
Really innovative, amazing. And we're seeing globally shifts away from hardened structures like levees. Bangladesh recently decided they were not going to move towards levee protection, instead more natural-based systems. They're more spongible, they can adapt to sea level rise. Joyce, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing globally as some innovative, novel approaches to be resilient and not maladaptive?
Yeah, well, first I just want to sort of talk a little bit about what maladaptation is, because I think it means many different things, which is fine, just like resilience. It can mean whatever you want from where you're sitting right now. But from me, maladaptation is two things. Either A, when we try to mitigate physical risks from climate change and we really spike up our use of fossil fuel energy to do so. So that would be maladaptation, because we are contributing more to greenhouse gas emissions at the same time that we're trying to build resilience. And then two is maladaptation is when you adapt in one thing, but it causes a knock-on effect that has a deleterious impact elsewhere. And the classic case is like you build a road in a place that didn't have a road previously so that people during the monsoon season can bring their produce to market from the highlands. But as you build that road, people are like, oh, this is so convenient. I'm going to put my house right here on the side of this mountain. And then in the next flood or the next storm, all of those homes are washed out because it's not a stable structure, but they were incited to move there because of the road. So from the perspective of like real innovation, I think that all the examples I can share are essentially a giant pot of soup. Remember Stregonona, where she was like, I'm going to put in this little thing and this little thing and make a big pot of soup that's going to feed everybody. This is a child's story for those of you who don't have kids or who's, but in any case, that's for me what the ultimate of real innovation and resilience is. And one example I would call on is Miami Beach, where they have pump structures to keep stormwater off of the land. They have elevated roads, they have elevated homes, and they are anticipating becoming Venice versus a set of islands that are completely risen above the water. And so those are just 4 examples of the many different tools that they are using to build extraordinary resilience. So resilience is almost never one thing. It's not one seawall that's going to protect these 4 properties behind it. It's not one housing complex that's going to receive the 100 homes that were underwater in the last storm. So a lot of diversity of examples make the resilient system.
I would add, slab on grade home in an area that gets water.
That's not adaptation.
That's maladaptation. Yeah. Okay, Bob.
I was just going to say that one way to avoid maladaptation, you see it in particular with large structural projects that have long lifetimes. Because when you build something that's going to last a long time, the chances are you might not anticipate something that might happen. So as an example, if you were to build a nuclear power plant, for instance, on a river, which you need for cooling, and then it turns out over time that river goes down in its level because of water scarcity related to climate change, then you can't run the nuclear power plant the way that you thought you could because you don't have enough water to draw. And so you thought that nuclear power was an energy that wasn't going to produce carbon, and that was supposed to be a good thing, but now you find out that because of climate change, it doesn't operate properly. That's actually a situation that we're having in some places in the United States, where we don't have enough water to cool our nuclear reactors. And seawalls and these kinds of things too. So it's anything that is going to cost a lot of money and last a long time, you need to think very, very hard about.
So we're running out of time. One last thing. What's one thing that we can do moving forward to become ahead of the game? I mean, and we already are ahead of the curve in many fronts, but what do we need to do? We'll go.
Oh, that's not fair. Buy more insurance. No. No, I think, it'd be really, really compelling to have the first state in the United States that actually has a financial plan for dealing with these exposures, not just the physical resilience and the social piece as well.
As a decision maker, before you make any decision, ask the question, how might climate change affect the effectiveness of my decision in the future? Just ask that every single time.
Andronika?
Find and use the political will to actually solve these problems.
Thank you. Joyce?
When you are planning for migration, not if, make social equity your first priority. And then you will be the bold and brilliant Louisiana that all of us know you can be.
Please help me give our guests a round of applause. Thank you so much.